We'll take another story from 2 Samuel, and we're coming to verse 18. And I really have enjoyed going over these. We've got more of this to go. I think most of us kind of generally know the story of David, but isn't it interesting to go back and review the details and let them add that color and depth and meaning to the things which we're about to read. Now, David has fled to Jerusalem. He has gone to Mahanaim, and his faithful soldiers had gone with him. But it's only that faithful few. Absalom has claimed the throne in Jerusalem and has gone from Dan to Beersheba to gather the men about him, and has a great host. And Absalom is going to lead that army himself against his father David to take him. But his soldiers are not like the soldiers of David. David's soldiers were like the professional army, very loyal to David. And these others, they're kind of like an all-volunteer army that are not going to be able to perform to the extent. And you're going to see something David does that shows his brilliancy as a military officer as we get into this story. So 2 Samuel 18. These are the last words. This is how it's going to end. David in grief. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son. I did not get to pick the memory verses. If I did, we would have memorized the last verse of this chapter. But instead, here's the memory verse. 2 Samuel 18:23. But howsoever, saith he, let me run. And he said unto him, run. Then Ahimaaz ran by the way of the plain and overran Cushai. Well, when you see it in the full story, that verse is going to take on more meaning. Out there by itself, it's just kind of what's going on here. So let's see what we have here. David's going to prepare his army. He gets it organized. David numbered the people that were with him and set captains over thousands and captains of hundreds over them. And David sent forth a third part of the people under the hand of Joab. Now, Joab's been that officer in David's army, the main officer, sort of the general chief of staffs has been Joab. He's head of the host. Joab, his brother, a third part under the hand of Abishai, son of Zeruiah, Joab's brother. And Abishai, he may not have as much of the smarts as Joab, but he's got all the fight that Joab has in him. And then this third part is interesting, under the hand of Ittai the Gittite. If you'll remember Ittai, he was one that came up from the area of the Philistines, saying, David, we're going to go with you. And he said, now you just showed up this last week. Says, you go on back to the Philistines. And Ittai so swore himself in allegiance to David that David is now entrusting him with a third of his army. And the king said to the people, I will go forth and lead you myself also. Well, that's how David usually went to the battle. But the people answered, Thou shalt not go forth. For if we flee away, they will not care for us. Neither if half of us die will they care for us. But now thou art worth 10,000 of us. Therefore it is better that thou succor us out of the city. And the king said unto them, What seemeth you best I will do. And the king stood by the gate side, and all the people came out by hundreds and by thousands. Sounds to me like David is getting tired, and David is getting old. He would like to go out and lead that battle, but he does have the wisdom now to listen to them, and they were right. This whole thing's about David. You remember the counsel that if we can just get David, this thing will be over. And so they said, David, 10,000 of us could be slain, and we could still go on. But if they get you, it's all over. You're worth more than 10,000 of us. And so David wisely heeds that advice and stays behind as his army goes out into the battle. But then before them all, as he's sending them away, the king commanded Joab and Abishai and Ittai, saying, deal gently for my sake with the young man, even with Absalom. David doesn't want Absalom killed. He wants his throne back. They could do this and take Absalom alive. And that was David's desire. All the people heard when the king gave the captain's charge concerning Absalom. So the people went out into the field against Israel, and the battle was in the wood of Ephraim. Okay, they're out in the woods. All the trees growing thick around them. Now, that shows some military strategy. When you're outnumbered, you want to fight in the woods. You don't get out on the plain like a football field. Everybody line up on one side and line on the other and charge each other and see who wins. You're sure to get slaughtered. Get out in the woods. They say in one of the ways the Americans would fight against the British, they'd fight like Indians. They'd get out in the woods and shoot from behind the trees. And so David is going to use the terrain of the battlefield, David and his generals, to their advantage. When the people of Israel were slain before the servants of David, there was a great slaughter that day of 20,000 men. And look at verse 8. The battle there was scattered over the face of all the country. It wasn't just one big clash like they would usually have, but it was little skirmishes all about this country. And it said the wood devoured more people that day than the sword devoured. There's been a time in my life where I really enjoyed reading about military history and military strategy. And I read a story about Grant and Lee in the wilderness of Virginia. Grant had the Union Army. They far outnumbered this ragtag, wore-out, beaten Confederate army. And Grant was the kind of general that when he went after you, he wasn't like these other generals. He could get beat and he'd stay after you. And he was going to use the force of the strength of the might that he had in his Union army against Lee. And Lee had Grant chase him into the wilderness. And Grant never could get a good battle out of him. He kept charging after Lee and coming after Lee, and Robert Lee and his men knew that terrain, and they were able to take advantage of the woods in the Virginia wilderness to defeat time after time Grant. They'd have to draw back a little bit, but it was at great losses to General Grant. In fact, they said that General Grant lost more men in the Battle of the Wilderness than Lee had in his whole army. And so that's the kind of strategy that David is using here. He's outnumbered, so you go to the wilderness and use the terrain and the battle tactics to your advantage. And it worked. They died there in the wilderness with David's fighting men. Verse 9. Absalom met the servants of David, and Absalom rode on a mule. And the mule went under a thick bough of a great oak, and his head caught hold of the oak, and he was taken up between heaven and the earth, and the mule that was under him went away. I remember when I was a young man, it may have been somebody's Sunday school picture that they drew in the book that had me thinking this. But they had Absalom caught by his hair in that tree. Him running through there, and his hair got caught in the branches, and the old mule took off and left him hanging there by his hair. Well, it doesn't say his hair got caught. It said his head got caught. Now, I've seen branches in the trees where they're all grown together and stick. And that's why David's fighting here. He's got the advantage here in the wilderness that he wouldn't have out on the plain. And Absalom's mule, it just ran right under those low branches. And I guess Absalom was trying to duck down, but it just ran his head right into the thickness of those boughs. And it must have caught him. And there he is hanging by his head now, dangling out there under that oak. and the mule, he just kept going. So a certain man saw it and told Joab and said, "Behold, I saw Absalom hanged in an oak." Well, Joab said, "Well, why didn't you kill him?" Here's what Joab says in verse 11. Joab said unto the man that told him, "And behold, thou sawest him, and why didst thou not smite him there to the ground? I would have given thee 10 shekels of silver and a girdle." It'd be like a belt. We were talking this morning about these people that wear these tool belts, you know. They wrap that belt around them. They got all these different kind of tools on it. And so he's going to have some kind of special girdle there. And these 10 shekels of silver said, "Man, I've given you a reward if you just gone ahead and slain him and knocked him to the ground." Well, the man said to Joab, "Though I should receive 1,000 shekels of silver in my hand, yet I would not put forth my hand against the king's son. For in our hearing the king charged thee and Abishai and Ittai, saying, Beware that none touch the young man Absalom. Otherwise, I should have wrought falsehood against my own life. For there is no matter hid from the king, and thou thyself would have set thyself against me." So I know what our orders are. I know what the king said. He said, "Deal gently with the young man. I'm not going to be the one to put him to death. Why, David, Joab, you yourself would put me to death if I did something like that." And Joab more or less says, "I don't have time to sit here and talk with you about this." Joab said, "I may not tarry thus with thee." And so he took 3 darts in his hand. And it says he thrust them through the heart of Absalom while he was yet alive in the midst of the oak. I tell you now, Joab, you want Abishai to put you to death. See, Abishai says, "Let's just cut off his head." That'd be a lot better way to go than Joab. He's going to let you die slow. He takes these 3 darts and thrusts them right into his heart. He does it in such a way that Absalom's still hanging there, suffering this, and yet he's alive. And then all these men, Joab, he must have had a lot of weapons. He had 10 men to carry his weapons with him when he went into the war. And it says the 10 men that bare Jacob's armor compassed about and smote Joab and slew him. It almost looks to me like if you ever been out coon hunting where you don't really want to kill the coon, you just kind of shoot him out of the tree so the dogs can get him when he hits the ground. And that's sort of what they've done here to Absalom. They're not dealing gently with the king's son, are they? Joab blew the trumpet. And at the sound of the trumpet, you can hear them out there. They knew, okay, the battle is over. We don't have to pursue our brothers in this civil war. Let them go on, return to their own tents and get home, and we'll cease this fighting. So Joab blew the trumpet, and the people returned for pursuing after Israel. Joab held the people back. Joab wasn't for unnecessary slaughter here, as long as they accomplished their objective. But they took Absalom, cast him into a great pit in the wood, and laid a very great heap of stones upon him. And all Israel fled every one to his tent. That's not what Absalom had planned. Absalom had planned his own funeral. In fact, he'd even set up a great monument, big pillar. Said this will be Absalom's pillar. People will know where he's buried. He's got his burial spot, his burial stone open, and he wants everyone to know about him. He thought he would die a great man. It says in verse 18, now Absalom in his lifetime had taken and reared up for himself a pillar, which is in the king's dale. For he said, I have no son to keep my name in remembrance. And he called the pillar after his own name, and it's called to this day Absalom's place. But Absalom wasn't buried there. Absalom's out in the woods somewhere under a pile of stones. That's what happened to him. I want you to notice how it said here, I have no son to keep my name in remembrance. Are you listening? Depends on how close attention you're paying to the text here, because you look back in 2 Samuel 14:27 we read, and unto Absalom there were born 3 sons and 1 daughter, whose name was Tamar. She was a woman of fair countenance. What about those 3 sons? Well, to get specific in the language, he says, I have no son to keep my name in remembrance. I don't know why those 3 sons couldn't do that, except perhaps, and some of the commentators suggested, those sons had not lived. It was very common for children to die sometime in their infancy. There's diseases and problems with young children growing up. There's many more born that ever grew into manhood. And so maybe by the time that Absalom put up this pillar, he did that after the death of his sons. So, well, they'll remember me this way. They'll see my great pillar where I have placed that self. That reminded me of another man. And we studied about him in the book of Isaiah. He was a treasurer, had a lot of money. And he decided he'd build himself a great mausoleum for him to be buried in, but he was just thrown out in the field when he died. We read about it in Isaiah 22, verses 15 through 19. Thus saith the Lord God of hosts, go get unto the treasurer, even to Shebna, which is over the house, and say, what hast thou here? And whom hast thou here? That thou hast hewed thee out a sepulchre here, as he that heweth him out a sepulchre on high, and that graveth a habitation for himself in a rock. Behold, the Lord will carry thee away with a mighty captivity, and will surely cover thee. He will surely violently turn, and toss thee like a ball into a large country, and there thou shalt die. And there the chariots of thy glory shall be the shame of thy Lord's house. And I will drive thee from thy station, and from thy state shall he pull thee down. Well, both Shebna and Absalom had, I guess they had one of these pre-death policies down at the funeral home. You know, man, this is going to be a great funeral when they bury me, and it'll be something people will remember. But it didn't work out that way, did it? Well, neither of these men, they die ingloriously, and they're cast out dishonorably. 2 Samuel 18 and verse 19. Then said Ahimaaz, do you remember him? Ahimaaz and Jonathan, the sons of the priest, they were part of that spy network. It was going to keep David's informed. And when Hushai told Zadok and Abiathar what was going on, they were going to get the word to Ahimaaz and Jonathan. And then the word got out. Remember the lad that overheard when they told the witch, and they overheard, and he went and told Absalom, and Absalom went after him. They had to hide in the well. And a woman covered the well up with a cloth and put grain over it, make it look like it's supposed to be there and all, and waited until they were gone, then uncovered the well and let them off. And they went and told David what was going on in Jerusalem. This is that Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok. Let me now run and bear the king's tidings, how that the Lord hath avenged him of enemies. Now notice how Ahimaaz attributes this great victory not to Joab and Abishai and Ittai, not even to David. It's the Lord that has done this. Joab said unto him, thou shalt not bear tidings this day, but thou shalt bear tidings another day. But this day thou shalt bear no tidings, because the king's son is dead. He didn't want Ahimaaz telling David that Absalom was dead. Now, there may be several reasons for that, but you might remember at the beginning of this Bible Bowl time in 1 Samuel 11, people coming to David with news about their enemies and those. David didn't always treat them very well. So maybe he just didn't want Ahimaaz being the one to tell David about the king's son. I want you to notice, though, Ahimaaz knew this. He knew Absalom was dead. He knew what had happened. Then said Joab to Cushai. Now that's the name. Other translations that I looked at calls him a man of Cush. That would be an Ethiopian. It's maybe a black man here that was up in David's army out of Africa. Cushai, go tell the king what thou hast seen. And Cushai bowed himself to Joab and ran. Now Ahimaaz doesn't give up. Then said Ahimaaz, son of Zadok, yet again to Joab, but howsoever, let me, I pray thee, also run after Cushai. Joab said, wherefore wilt thou run, my son, seeing thou hast no tidings ready? So we don't have anything. Cushai tell him everything he needs to know. Why do you want to go follow Cushai? But howsoever, here's that memory verse, he said, let me run. He said unto him, run. Then Ahimaaz ran by the way of the plain and overran Cushai. I was talking class this morning, so like Ahimaaz is a faster runner, and that may very well be, but it looked like he took a different route. I bet you old Cushai, he's still running through the wilderness, dodging all those trees, but old Ahimaaz, he takes out and gets out in the plain. Maybe he's taking a shortcut right across the plain to get there first, but at any rate, he gets ahead of Cushai, and when they see that first runner, it's not Cushai they see, it's Ahimaaz. Let's go back to Mahanaim. There's a lookout trying to watch for what's going to happen. Will they see the army coming back in mass retreat? David sat between the two gates, and the watchman went up to the roof over the gate into the wall, and lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, a man running alone. And the watchman cried and told the king, and the king said, if he be alone, there is tidings in his mouth. And he came apace and drew near. David's wanting to know what's happening. So he's coming along. This is not the army in retreat. This must be a messenger from one of my generals coming to give me news of what has taken place. Well, the watchman saw another man running. And the watchman called unto the porter and said, behold, another man running alone. And the king said, well, he also brings tidings. And the watchman said, methinketh the running of the foremost is like the running of Ahimaaz the son of Zadok. And the king said, he's a good man and comes with good tidings. He expected good news from Ahimaaz. Ahimaaz must have been quite a runner, a distinctive runner. Somehow as he's running, said, man, that guy's running the way Ahimaaz runs, and could identify that. And so here comes Ahimaaz. He's head of the pack now with Cushai behind, and Ahimaaz actually gets there first with the news. And Ahimaaz called and said to the king, all is well. And he fell down on the earth upon his face before the king. Now, what he's doing, he's showing the king's honor. He's probably out of breath, too. But he fell down before the king on his face and said, blessed be the Lord thy God, which hath delivered up the men that lifted up their hand against my lord the king. Well, he did bring glad tidings, didn't he? David said this, is the young man Absalom safe? And Ahimaaz answered, when Joab sent the king's servant and me thy servant, I saw a great tumult, but I knew not what it was. Now that wasn't so. Ahimaaz knew the king's son was dead, remember? But he didn't want to tell David. He said, well, I don't know. The king said unto him, turn aside and stand here. And he turned aside and stood, and behold, Cushai came. And Cushai said, tidings, my lord the king. Same message. For the Lord hath avenged thee this day of all them that rose up against thee. And David asked the question again. The king said to Cushai, is the young man Absalom safe? Now Cushai's answer here is a great answer. It's hard to bring bad news, isn't it? And it's good if you know how to deliver real bad news with the tact that Cushai used here. It didn't lessen David's grief, but I just admire Cushai for the indirect way he let David know, almost a complimentary way, he let David know just what had happened. The enemies of my Lord the King, and all that rise against thee to do thee hurt, be as that young man is. Isn't that just sweet and gentle and a thoughtful way to inform that father about the death of his son? And so the king was much moved. He went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And as he went, he said, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom. Would God I had died for thee, O Absalom, my son, my son." David, in this great victory for his people, is suffering great personal loss. Is the young man safe? I heard my father preach several times this sermon through the years as I was growing up with him, and go off with him to a gospel meeting or show up somewhere when he was preaching. It must have been one of his sermons he felt like he could deliver effectively. Is the young man safe? You see, David asked that question too late. No, Absalom is dead. He's not safe. He's not physically safe. The kind of boy he was, he wasn't spiritually safe either. When should David have asked that question? Is the young man safe? He should have thought about that before he married his mother. She was the daughter of a pagan king. He married her for political advantage. He should have thought about who he was going to marry, and that's something that we need to consider. And I want to talk to the young folks here that aren't married yet. I want you to remember they aren't. I know you're not married yet, so listen to this. Someday I want you to pick a girl that make a good mother for your children. See, that's because most of the time when you get married, you're going to get children to follow. And you want to think, okay, I know this is a good person to marry, but will this be a good parent for my child? Ask the question then, is the young man safe, before you decide who you're going to marry. David should have asked that question before he messed around with Bathsheba, shouldn't he? I tell you, no child is safe when their parents engage in that kind of activity. And David should have been asking that question while the boy was growing up. David had the chance as a father to discipline his children and to teach them what was right and wrong and to instruct them in the way of the Lord. But now it's too late. Absalom's dead. And he did not die a good man. And David is in grief and regret over what he neglected. Well, let's not let that happen to us. Young folks, listen, don't let that happen to you. You determine now. You see, the way that we live now as young people, Riley, as young people, it's the way we conduct ourselves as children, Georgia, and Bryce, and Lillian, and okay, you two boys, you're not married yet. Bradley, you almost are, but you need to start asking this question, see? What about my children before I decide that I'm going to get married? And Thomas, you need to ask this. Are my children safe? And it's the way that we live before we're married that will have a lot to do with how safe our children will be. Because you see, children grow up and they want to be like mom and daddy. And if they know, and they will know, they'll know how you, listen, all they got to do now is get on Facebook, see what kind of person you are. They're going to know who you are. If you are a good young person, they'll want to be good young people. It'll follow in that way. So right now, think far ahead. Beat the rest of this crowd out here that's going to make a lot of mistakes. And you young people here, you think, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to think all the way ahead now to my grown children. And I'm going to start living now in a way that when my children have their children, I'm going to know my grandchildren are safe. And we can do that as young people and then follow through on that. But when we don't do it and we make mistakes, we may suffer the grief like David did, but God is gracious and merciful and good, and He will forgive and heal and bring you back. So if you need to respond to the invitation tonight, are you safe? Are my children safe? Are my grandchildren safe? And live in such a way that they will be. And you need to become a child of God. Now let's extend the invitation.